Well, this is a particularly boring subject, but an exceptionally important one, so whether you watch it or not is up to you. We're going to look at a very important principle of the type of economy we have and its spillover into culture and how it has an impact on each and every one of us. I'm talking about the monopolisation. That's right. Monopolisation, or the creation of monopolies, is the logical endpoint of a deregulated capitalist system. Now, even governments are aware of that because we have competitions commissions whose job it is to ensure that competition occurs in society, because theoretically increased competition means decreased prices. Now, capitalism is a very simple concept. It's about private investment for private profit. It's a simple concept, but if there is no regulation on the type of activities that capital can be involved in, then we have the creation of monopolies, and we see this all around us, whether it's the new monopolies which have been created as a result of the digital revolution, or the old legacy monopolies. Because Australia, unlike even the home of capitalism, the United States of America, doesn't even have antitrust laws which force monopolies to break up if they reach a certain size, if they dominate more than 30% of the economy, although we've seen that these antitrust laws have been useless in terms of regulating and dealing with the monopolisation of the digital space. So what we've seen over the last 40 years, possibly a half a century, is the philosophy that government should get out of the way of capital while it continues to maximise profits for its major shareholders or private owners, irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs. So that's what deregulation has been about. That's what globalisation has been about. That's what corporatisation has been about. It's about creating an economy that only has one type of philosophy or ideology which guides it. And that philosophy and ideology is the maximisation of profits, irrespective of harm to society, without governments regulating. That's right, without governments regulating their activities. So what have we seen in the last half a century as we've given capital its head and we have allowed it to grow and grow and grow like Topsy? So what we've seen is the creation of monopolies. Simple concepts. When you have a monopoly, it's a little bit like having to deal with the company store. In the good old days, workers in many industries could only trade at the company store, and that meant increased prices. We saw this during the foundation of the settler settlement here in Australia, where the New South Wales Army Corps had a monopoly on the purchase and distribution of goods, and we saw the resultant famine as a result of that monopoly. So getting back to the 21st century, The question is not what has occurred. The question is, what can we do about it? Because that's the central essence. Now, yesterday I found myself in a supermarket, and this woman with a few children bent down to pick up 4 litres of oil, olive oil, and the price was $65. And she bolted upright and she said to her children, she said, "We can't afford this. Somebody, and it's that great somebody, should do something about this. These supermarkets should be brought to account." Well, we as a society have believed the propaganda. We as individuals have believed the propaganda that deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation will improve our lives, forgetting this is what occurred in the 18th and 19th century, where the lives of ordinary people who'd broken out of a feudal system found themselves in the majority of cases worse off in the feudal system they had laboured under for hundreds of years. So in the first quarter of the 21st century we find ourselves in the same position, where monopolies dominate every aspect of our activity. And nothing highlights this more than when you go into a supermarket or a petrol station, or even involved in, the ever, the rush to find a new energy company, to find somebody to build your home, to find somewhere to live, and the list goes on and on. Because ultimately, there is no competition when there's no regulation. There is no competition, and this is the key point of this talk, there is no competition when there is only one economic system that dominates every aspect of our existence. Not just in terms of purchasing power, not in terms of what we can purchase, but in terms of culture, in terms of ideology, in terms of human interaction, in terms of the way we interact with the people around us, in terms of our interactions within families. Because monopolies are bad for everyone. Although some people are under the mistaken belief, because their superannuation company invests in monopolies, that somehow they benefit. But the end point is, there is no benefit. And that's a dilemma we face ourselves, are faced with in 21st century Australia. The monopolisation of every aspect of our existence, from our thought process to our purchasing ability. A huge issue which most people are not aware of or not interested in, although it dominates every aspect of their existence. So, apart from revolution, there are things that can occur. We can create a mixed economy in a capitalist society, and it's the mixed economy which creates competition. And when I'm talking about a mixed economy, I'm talking about a private investment for private profit model working alongside a cooperative collective model, working alongside a publicly owned model. I'll give you a simple example. 40 years ago, when the Commonwealth Bank, which is created by the blood, sweat and tears of people in this country, when it was created in 1911 to provide finance to small business people and the general population, and to overcome the failure of the banks of the 1890s, the collapse of the banking system in this country. When it was privatised, we saw the end of competition in the banking sector. And the Royal Commission into the banking sector, the financial sector, highlighted the illegal activities for which not one member of that sector has found themselves in court for, that they pursued in order to maximise their profits, because there was no competition, because people could go nowhere else. They just went to another of the big banks and found themselves in exactly the same situation. While the Commonwealth Bank was in public hands, that's owned by the government of the day, we had some competition in terms of the pressure that as citizens we could place on the government of the day in terms of its ability to give instructions to the Commonwealth Bank and provide that competition. Today, all the banks can do, all the citizen can do, is rely on underfunded, unregulated, supposedly organisations set up to government to regulate the private sector. And the major finding of the Royal Commission was that that regulation did not occur because these statutory authorities which have been set up by government to keep an eye on the financial sector weren't resourced. They didn't have not only didn't they have the resource, they didn't have the legislative ability to intervene or let alone find out the information that was required. So this is the dilemma when you only have one economic system in a sovereign nation state. Because that economic system, if it's based on private investment for private profit, creates, not tends to, but creates monopolies in all facets of everyday existence. So why isn't there a cooperative or a collectivist sector of the economy in this country? There was an attempt in the 1890s to create cooperatives and collectives, but since then, apart from a very few marginalised cooperatives and collectives who can't provide any real competition in their particular sector, we find there are none. And what we saw during the great demutualisation period in the 1980s and the 1990s, we saw those mutual associations which have been set up to help people deal with the issues they faced, demutualised, like the Australian Mutual Provident Society, AMP, a huge financial institution, as the Royal Commission found, using illegal and unconscionable strategies to improve the profits. So demutualisation of organisations which have been around for over a century to assist their members, the breaking down of that broke down any competition in that particular sector. So why don't we see the rise of cooperatives and collectives in a monopolised society? Because the financial sector refuses to lend seeding funding to that sector. And I've said over and over again in these YouTube presentations that 1% of superannuation funds should be used as seeding funding for the creation of cooperatives and collectives. Nobody gets sick, nobody gets rich being a member of a cooperative or a collective, but it does provide work and it allows people to live a reasonable existence and provide goods and services, unlike the privatised sector. And a strong collective and cooperative sector would provide competition against the private sector, especially in areas that are labour intensive. Instead of importing everything from overseas, cheap, nasty products which have an inbuilt lifespan, you could use cooperatives and collectives to create goods and products, especially products which have a long life, especially in an era where inbuilt obsolescence is the name of the game in the private sector. At the same time, we could see the reintegration of essential services into the public sector. We've seen the privatisation of Medibank Private and all the ensuing problems after its privatisation, the privatisation of state energy systems and all the ensuing problems that has created, the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank and the lack of competition in that sector, the privatisation of Qantas, our national carrier, and all the problems that has created, the privatisations of sections of the train and railway system, the privatisation of the energy sector, the privatisation of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, and all the problems that created during the COVID-19 pandemic, which continues, although we now have the protection of medication as well as vaccination. So we should be re-establishing publicly owned essential services, telecommunications, the World Wide Web, search engines, financial institutions, and the list goes on and on. Because what happens when you have a strong public sector, it acts as competition against the private sector. So in a perfect capitalist society, you would have a combination of economies. You would have privately owned facilities, you would have publicly owned facilities, and you would have cooperatives and collectives, and each sector would be competing against the other sector, which would result in decreased prices, better service, and more importantly, more stable environment for people living in this country. So think about it. Next time people talk to you about how they're finding it more and more difficult to survive, how they have to deal with monopolies, how so much of their time is wasted trying to access basic services, and how much it's costing them, well, talk to them about the reason they find themselves in that situation. As I said at the beginning of this small presentation, the creation of monopolies is the logical outcome of a deregulated capitalist system. The best way to create competition within a capitalist society is to create institutions which compete against it, not just regulations which are ineffective, but institutions, publicly owned institutions, collectives and cooperatives, and make sure there are the resources to create these alternatives. If you're interested in these concepts, I encourage you to go to the Public Interest Before Corporate Interests webpage, pibci.info, and if you want to join, you can join online. If you can't join online, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489. Next week, who knows what we'll be talking about.